Hi, I'm John, and in this IT Taster video I'm going to show you how to configure password and account policies within a Windows Server 2012 R2 domain. Now, passwords are one of the most common methods in use to identify users when they log into the network, and this is a process known as authentication. Now, in order to maintain a secure network environment, we need to make sure our users choose strong passwords and that they change those passwords on a regular basis. And within Windows Server 2012, there are a few useful tools that enable us to achieve this. But before we look at that, it's worth me mentioning that educating users also plays an important role in maintaining network security. So educate your users and get them on board. Password and account policy configuration settings can be found in Group Policy. Password and account policies need to be configured within a Group Policy object, a GPO with the highest precedence, which is the default domain policy. If you're not too familiar with Group Policy, then why not take a look at the Configuring Group Policy tutorial videos on the IT Taster channel. Now, I'm working with Windows Server 2012 R2 in this video, and to open Group Policy we need to be in Server Manager, we need to click Tools, and we need to click Group Policy Management. This opens up the Group Policy Management console, and we need to expand the forest, expand domains, expand the ittaster.local domain, and here we can see the default domain policy, and this is where we're going to make our changes. We need to right click the default domain policy and choose Edit. Now, word of warning, the default domain policy has the highest precedence. It affects the whole domain and all of the objects within it. That means users, including the administrator, computers, servers and domain controllers, so take care when making changes. Okay, under computer configuration we need to expand policies, we need to expand Windows settings, just widen that a little, we need to expand security settings, expand account policies, and click on password policy. The first policy I'm going to cover is password must meet complexity requirements. Simply double click the policy to open it, and as we can see, the policy is already enabled. Now, when you're working with policies, it's a good idea to click the Explain tab and read through the explanation. There's some really useful information here. In fact, it gives us the exact details of the policy, the rules that our passwords must follow. Passwords must not contain the user's account name or parts of the user's full name that exceed 2 consecutive characters. Passwords must be at least 6 characters in length. However, this is subject to the minimum password length policy. And passwords must contain characters from at least 3 of the following 4 categories, which are English uppercase characters, English lowercase characters, numbers 0 through to 9, and symbols. Now, there's some important information about the policy too. Password complexity requirements are enforced when passwords are changed or created. You need to keep this in mind if the policy has been disabled for any reason. It won't affect existing users until they are required to change their password. Now, we can also see that by default the policy is applied to domain controllers and member workstations. I want to keep this policy enabled, so I'm going to click OK. Now, the next policy I'm going to take a look at is the minimum password length policy. Again, double click it to open it. Now, the minimum password length policy setting allows us to configure the minimum number of characters user passwords must contain. Click the Explain tab for more details about the policy, and it tells us that we can set a value of 1 to 14 characters. Now, note that if you set the policy setting to 0, no password is required. Not a good idea. And you'd also need to disable the passwords must meet complexity requirements policy setting. But quite simply, don't do it, stick to best practice. This policy is enabled by default and currently set to 7 characters. Best practice is to set the minimum password length to at least 8 characters. This provides a reasonable level of security because if passwords are too long, they can become difficult for users to remember. So I'm going to set the minimum password length to 8 characters as per best practice and click OK. Another useful policy we can configure is the maximum password age policy. Double click the policy to open it and click the Explain tab so we can see exactly what the policy does. Now the maximum password age policy lets us specify the amount of time in days a password can remain in use before the user is required to change it. Passwords can be set to expire from 1 to 999 days. Now you can also set passwords so they never expire by setting the number of days to 0. Security best practice is to set the maximum password age to a value between 30 and 90 days. Now we can see the default setting, passwords will expire, is in 42 days. Now I'd like my users' passwords to expire a little earlier than this, so I'm going to choose 30 days and click OK. Okay, now that we've set our maximum password age, let's take a look at the minimum password age policy. Double click the policy to open it and click the Explain tab. Now the minimum password age policy setting is used to specify the amount of time in days a password must remain in use for before it can be changed by the user. We can set a value from between 1 and 998 days. And there are a few things to be aware of. The minimum password age policy setting must be less than the maximum password age specified. Alternatively, users can change their passwords as often as they wish if we set this policy setting to 0 days. However, the minimum password age must be set to a value greater than 0 if you want to enforce a password history policy. Now best practice recommends we set the minimum password age policy to 2 days, and that's what I'm going to do. Our users can now change their passwords after 2 days and click OK. The next policy I want to show you is the Enforce Password History policy. The Enforce Password History policy setting enables us to specify the number of passwords that will be retained by the server before an old password can be reused again. This setting forces users to choose new passwords that they haven't previously used, which greatly improves security. The longer a password remains in use, the greater the risk of an attacker cracking it. Now the explanation tells us that we can specify a password history policy setting from 0 to 24 passwords. If we set the policy to 0, then any previously used passwords won't be retained by the server, and this will allow users to reuse passwords. Now the last paragraph of the explanation recommends the minimum password age policy setting is enabled. This is to prevent users from quickly cycling through passwords in order to reuse a previous password. Now the default setting for the password history policy is 24, and this is also best practice. So all I need to do is click OK. And finally, the store passwords using reversible encryption policy. Now I'm not going to cover this policy setting in too much detail. It's more applicable to how passwords are stored. The explanation tells us that enabling this policy is the equivalent of storing passwords in plain text, which obviously is not a good idea. Now this policy setting is disabled by default and should remain so. So I'm going to leave it well alone and click OK. Let's move on to account lockout policies. Click Account Lockout Policy and we can see our account lockout policy settings. Account lockout policies provide additional security when implemented with password security policy settings. Account lockout policies can be used to lock user accounts if an incorrect password is entered. They help prevent attempts to guess passwords, particularly those using automated tools to carry out brute force attacks. Okay, let's start with the account lockout threshold policy. The account lockout threshold policy setting lets us configure how many failed logon attempts a user is allowed before their account is locked. The explanation tells us that we can set a value between 0 and 999 failed logon attempts. Now if we specify a value of 0, which is the default setting for this policy, user accounts won't be locked out if an incorrect password is entered. The explanation tells us this setting also applies to users locking their workstations and also password protected screensavers. Now it's important to be aware that implementing an account lockout policy can impact on the organization. If users accidentally lock their accounts, this prevents them from working and generates support calls for the help desk. Now I'm going to set my account lockout threshold to 3, and this will lock user accounts after 3 failed logon attempts. Now because we've specified an account lockout threshold and we've yet to define these other policies, we need to click OK to accept the suggested values. The next policy is the account lockout duration policy. The account lockout duration policy setting lets us configure the number of minutes a user's account will be locked out before it's automatically unlocked. We can set a value of 0 to 99,999 minutes. If a value of 0 is specified, the user will remain locked out until an administrator unlocks the account, and I'll show you how to do that later on in the video. Now the explanation also tells us that the value we specify must be greater than or equal to the value set for the account reset lockout counter policy, which we'll look at next. Now I'm going to specify a value of 0, which will require the administrator to unlock the account if the account's lockout threshold is reached. And click OK. And finally, we have the reset account lockout counter after policy. Now the explanation for this policy can be a little confusing. What this policy setting does is allow us to specify a time in minutes before the password threshold counter is reset to 0. So for example, if we set a password lockout threshold to 3 failed logon attempts, and if we also set the reset account lockout counter after policy to 1 minute, then if a user enters an incorrect password but waits 1 minute before attempting to log on again, the password reset threshold counter goes back to 0 and therefore doesn't count as a failed logon. Now the explanation tells us we can set a value of 1 to 99,999 minutes. And the explanation also tells us if an account lockout policy is set higher than 0, the reset time specified must be set to a value that is less than or equal to the account lockout duration policy setting we covered previously. This policy only comes into effect when an account lockout threshold is specified. I'm going to leave the policy set at 30 minutes and click OK. OK, let's put the policy configuration to the test. we need to click on the Tools menu option, open up Active Directory Users and Computers, right click one of our user accounts, we'll go for user 1, and choose Reset Password. Now I'm going to enter a weak password that deliberately doesn't meet our password policy criteria. I'm simply going to type password in lowercase. And click OK. And an error dialog box pops up informing us Windows cannot complete the password change for user 1 because the password does not meet the password policy requirements. And it tells us to check the minimum password length, password complexity and password history requirements. And we know that password doesn't meet the password complexity requirements. Okay, let's try that again. We'll go back to our user account, right click it and choose Reset Password. But this time I'm going to enter a different password. I'm going to type password beginning with a capital P and a number 5. And this time the password for user 1 has been successfully changed. We have a password 9 characters long with an uppercase character, lowercase characters and a number, which meets password complexity policy requirements. Now password 5 will suffice for this demo, but it's certainly not a password we would wish to use outside of the lab environment. Okay, let's go to a client workstation so we can put our account lockout policies to the test. Okay, we're now ready to log on to the domain using a Windows 7 workstation so we can test our account lockout policies. Now if you remember, we set the account lockout threshold to 3, which will allow 3 attempts to enter the password correctly, subject to the Reset Account Lockout Counter After policy setting. We left the Reset Account Lockout Counter After setting configured to 30 minutes, which means if the user enters an incorrect password, they must wait at least 30 minutes before their next logon attempt, otherwise it will count as a failed logon. So if the user enters 3 incorrect passwords and doesn't wait at least 30 minutes before each logon attempt, the account will be locked out after 3 attempts. Now because we set the account lockout duration setting to 0, the user will remain locked out until an administrator unlocks the account. I'm going to enter an incorrect password 3 times without waiting 30 minutes between each login attempt, so the Reset Account Lockout Counter won't reset. And I'm going to be logging on as user 1. We receive our first error message telling us the username or password is incorrect, and that's our first attempt. Again another error, our second attempt, and again another error. So that's 3 failed login attempts. I'm going to try once more. And we receive an error telling us the referenced account is currently locked out and may not be logged onto. The user account is locked. So let's go back to the server and I'll show you how to unlock a user account. Okay, I've logged back into our domain controller and we're in Active Directory Users and Computers where we left it. Now to unlock a user account, all you need to do is double click the user account, in this case user 1, click on the Account tab, and as you can see this account is currently locked out on this Active Directory domain controller. All we need to do is tick the Unlock Account box and click OK. If we double click our user 1 account again, click on Account, and we can see that our user 1 account is no longer locked. Now, one important thing to be aware of when implementing account lockout policies is that any administrator accounts that you create can be locked in exactly the same way. However, the account lockout policy doesn't apply to the built-in administrator account. Well, I hope this video has been helpful and it's given you a better understanding of password and account policies. Please subscribe to the IT Taster channel, your comments are welcome, and thanks very much for watching.